Hello and welcome. My name is Sanjoy Roy and I am joined on the stairs today again by choreographer Shobana Singh. Today we're going to be looking at two pieces that responded to visual arts in different ways. The first is called Études, which was a solo by dancer Noura Kela, performed alongside an exhibition of sculptures by Auguste Rodin. The sculptures were made just before the First World War of a dancer and acrobat actually, called Alda Moreno. So when I first saw it back in 2016, my first entry point was to think of the chain, I guess. It started as a dancer into sculpture, and then now 100 years later, the chain was from sculpture back into dancer. So that was my entry point. Shobana, how about you?
Yeah, well, in Etude, I had to make some decisions very, very quickly because I only really had a very short moment inside the gallery to prepare. The exhibition actually had already been designed by the time I came in. And so I was kind of faced with a small rectangular room with a glass cabinet in the middle with all the sculptures inside. And so the first thing I noticed really is how small the sculptures were. So I was thinking, well, how am I going to fit in this real-time dancer? She would end up looking ginormous if she stood next to them. So there was this kind of problem of scale. And then there was framing, because I didn't have the normal things that choreographers had, like light or music or stage. And I didn't want her to wander around the room in a kind of vacuum. So what I decided to do was to actually put her on the other side of the glass cabinet. So that seemed to solve that problem, because suddenly she had a frame, and also she was kind of mediated, because you had a pane of glass, then you had the sculptures, and then you had another pane of glass, then you saw the dancer with the wall behind her, which also had paintings of other sketches by Rodin. So we kind of ended up with this, as you mentioned, this kind of very cyclical thing of dancer looking at sculptures of dance which were looked at by Rodin in the first place.
Yeah, lots of layers there. Um, let me say a bit more about the sculptures themselves, because they're very extreme poses a lot of the time, very exposed, and they're so different from figures that you might think of the kind of more gauzy, romantic ballerinas that you might expect from even 10, 20 years earlier than that. So they're actually kind of hardcore in some way. So I was thinking about the tension there, whether it's the tension between this physicality as a kind of casting off of 19th century corsetry, or is it more to do with exposing the female body to the male gaze, for example? And I know that as a choreographer, you're rather attracted to ambivalences. Was that ambivalence something that you were interested in?
Well, I'm always very aware of that male gaze towards the naked female body, which you see a lot in Western paintings. Actually, this was a little bit different, because he was painting a dancer, or he was sculpting a dancer, he was gazing at a dancer whose relationship to their own body was, it's a bit like a violinist to a violin. So in some ways, it wasn't portrayed in an intrusive way. I mean, yes, the body had been stretched to its limits. So actually, the male gaze wasn't a big issue with me. More than that was really, in a way, trying to show what the dancer might feel like inside when they were being sculpted. Because I think for Rodin, probably, well, it was certainly in a sculpture, what you're aware of is the absolute stillness of holding a balance like that. Because obviously to the outside eye, it just, in a good dancer, it looks like a moment of stillness. What I wanted to kind of explore was really the work that would have been going inside the dancer's body as she took these poses. And as she held them, she would have prepared for them, she would have stretched into them, and then she would have held them. But the center of her body would have been incredibly dynamic, and working very hard to actually sustain that pose. So one of the things I wanted Nora to do was to actually, I asked her to actually move just on one leg, holding this very extreme moment, and then move along the glass cabinet. I probably wasn't very popular for asking her to do that, and it was the wobble, it was the effort that actually, in a way, it's erased from Rodin's sculptures. I wanted to kind of bring that effort into the foreground.
Okay, so there was a really physical approach there, and I know that in the film we're going to see that wobble, which I still, if I may, I like to think of it as a slightly metaphorical wobble as well as physical. But let's talk a bit more about Outlander now, which is the next piece that we'll see. This was also made in 2016, like Études, but it was a completely different setting. It was in the monks' refectory of a Palladian basilica in Venice called the Basilica of San Giorgio. And at one end, it had a very large painting by Paolo Veronese, which was done in 1563, I remembered. I know that painting was your starting point. Can you tell me a bit more about how you worked in relation to the painting?
Well, the painting, as you mentioned, was in this beautiful Palladian refectory where the monks ate. But the thing to note about the painting is that it's not really the real painting that's there in Venice at the moment. So the original is in France because, Napoleon, when he conquered Venice, he transported this painting and now it's at the Louvre in Paris. So what we see now in this refectory is actually a very beautifully rendered digital copy, which is very powerful because it's in the right place. So when I looked at the painting, one of the characters that really caught my eye was this lady, whom I call the lady with the golden toothpick, because of the guests, I think she's one of the very few who actually looks straight at the audience. And she seems to be, in some ways, trying to tell us that she's rather an exceptional person because she's not involved in the rest of the very stylish Venetian banquet that's happening. And so she's sitting there, kind of quite indolently with this long toothpick. And apparently in those days, it was very fashionable to carry your own toothpick with you to banquets. And the rest of the guests, the way I kind of saw them was they seemed to be engaged in what was called spezzatura. I think like in 1528, Castiglione published this book called The Courtier, and it really explained how the elegant, the wealthy person should behave. So their whole physicality was one of style. Well, it's a kind of, Renaissance handbook for being cool and acting cool. And so, everybody else in the banquet seemed to be doing that, but this lady, the lady with the golden toothpick, did that more than anybody else. And so the choreography really was the kind of a riff on how I read this lady. The Outlander originally had 3 solos, but actually this evening we're only going to see one of those.
Okay, I really like sprezzatura and riff and coolness. Sounds great. It reminds me of, I don't know, Italians having spritz and having sprezzatura at the same time. Nice word. I'm going to come right back at you, actually. If you're using Italian, I have a word for you too, which is ekphrasis, which I looked up. And ekphrasis is a work of art about another work of art. And apparently it's usually in the form of, it's usually used in poetry, mostly ekphrastic poetry. But here, I think you're doing ekphrastic choreography. So
that's wonderful to know. Thank you.
So let's have a look at these 2 pieces of ekphrastic choreography now.
I know I'm close to the end of something. Before, I dreamed of nothing worth mentioning. Now my dreams are all about tomorrow and the day after. And when I wake up, even if it takes a while, time seems to pause.
Great. And when I looked at those two pieces just now, the thing that really struck me was the facing. If I were to say the difference between the two, the really striking difference for me is that Etude looks at the art and Outlander looks away from the art. It's almost like Etude uses the art as a point of reference and Outlander uses it as a point of departure to then establish its own choreographic space, I guess. Is that how you saw it?
To tell you the truth, that's the first time I've noticed that. I was probably too busy choreographing. You're right. In Etude, the dancers looking at the artwork, and in Outlander, the dancers dancing away from the artwork. I think it probably had its roots in something really simple. It's where the artwork actually was in the building. So it's to do with the relationship between the artwork and the site. So in Outlander, there was a very, very strong move. As soon as I saw the building, the room, I knew that the audience had to sit on the sides, by the wall. And I was amazed to find that later, after I'd made the decision, that actually the monks did indeed sit on long tables by the walls, leaving the middle totally empty. So that's where I decided to put the dancer.
I like that idea of the audience sort of being in the position of the monks at their dining table, and then you serve up the solos for us. Great. If you at home would like to find out more about Outlander, do listen to the episode 3 of the Surface Tension podcast by Shobana Jayasingh Dance, which you can find on the Shobana Jayasingh Dance channels on YouTube, Spotify, YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and SoundCloud. There we are. In the meantime, Shobana, when are we going to meet again on the stairs?
Well, I hope to meet you on the 20th of July, when we'll be looking at Material Man, which is a dance work I made in response to indentured labor. Often, well, actually, people don't often wonder what happened when slavery was abolished, who actually did the work then. And the answer is that many millions of people were actually moved from the Indian subcontinent to go and work in these colonial plantations. So Material Man is really about that subject.
Great. Well, I look forward to revisiting, and I hope that the audience will join us again on the stairs then. So it just remains for me to leave you with a short film, which is of an outreach program that Shobana Jayasingh Dance did with some school students at the National Gallery. Do join us again on 20th of July, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much for watching and listening.
We came here last Friday on an art trip because we was doing about movement, and then on Thursday we expressed the movement with paint, and we were working together to make big pieces.
We've been putting together a performance piece. It's called Perspectives, and it's about the perspective that we have in the modern era within like social media and different aspects of the world.
We've been going through a creative process of making a dance from art work and looking at movement within art and how that's captured. We improvised a lot to see what would work and what didn't.
When I think about art, my mental state tells me that art is about drawing, expressing your feelings on paper, but this dance, I think, was more of art of movement, as you express yourself through the flow of your body and how you moved.
When I was in the dancing, because it was my first time, I felt a bit awkward. As we did it throughout the time given, I felt more confident to do the moves.
I feel so much more respected as a dancer, and I feel like everyone's ideas have been shared and executed, and it's so incredible.